Okay, here's the list of representative stars for this lecture. First, we have some more Romanesque churches to see, and then we'll get to the Gothic era. Abbot Suger de Saint-Denis is not the most well-known fellow in this list, but he is an important writer and is also usually given credit for building the first Gothic church. Base-born, he rose by talent, perseverance, and good luck to be the regent of France, while Louis VII was off on the Second Crusade with his famous wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. After Eleanor's divorce from Louis, she married the future Henry II of England and became the mother of Richard, known as the Lion-Hearted, which, according to Churchill, pays a compliment to lions. Okay, that's the quick story. If you want the details, just stay tuned. So as we saw last time, it's not unusual to find churches which are part Romanesque and part Gothic, and this is another such example, the Cathedral of Saint-Lazare, St. Lazarus at Autun. In this view you can see the 15th century crossing tower, a relatively rare Gothic feature in France, and the 13th century Gothic upper choir, but most of the church was built in the first half of the 12th century, and is therefore nominally Romanesque. Last time I told a story about Mary Magdalene and her companions, and you may remember that, according to that story, this is where the bones of Lazarus now lie. This is the nave now looking toward the choir. And in that choir, you can see a clear difference between the earlier, smaller 12th century windows and the much larger, higher Gothic windows of a century later above. The nave arcade itself, however, could almost pass for Gothic, with its pointed arches and sculpturesque treatment. About all it lacks is a ribbed groin vault. If you don't look up, you might well suppose yourself to be in a Gothic church here as far as the overall ambiance and architectural personality go. One of the most important things about Autun here is the sculpture, and this is the tympanum over the entrance. Whether or not you consider this more impressive than the timpani we saw last time at Moissac or Souillac or Conques, it is signed by the artist in a way we'll see in just a minute, and that has drawn more attention to it than to just about any other 12th century French sculpture. The subject is the usual Last Judgment, with the saved on the right hand of the Lord and the damned on his left. Here's the figure of Christ up closer now. In the 18th century, when this had come to be regarded as insufferably primitive, it was plastered over and painted with something probably inspired by Boucher or Fragonard. And since Christ's head stuck out too far, it was just knocked off so the surface would be smooth. In 1948, after the last of the plaster had been taken away, since taste had once again changed, the choirmaster discovered that the head was in the Roland Museum across the street, and he was able to get it put back up on the figure as we see it now. This whole episode drew new attention to the work and to the fact that it is perhaps the earliest surviving signed work in the history of French art. In this detail from directly below the feet of Christ, we see an angel banishing the damned to the right and a figure to the left of the angel looking up at the name Giselbertus, or however he pronounced it. He's the second figure from the left. The inscription, written about 1135, reads, Giselbertus hoc fecit. Giselbertus made this. It is likely, I think, that the figure looking up at the name is supposed to represent Giselbertus himself. Although it is only technically a self-portrait, he didn't really look like this unless he got off a flying saucer. And the rest of the figures are also barely humanoid, let alone individuals who might be recognized. Which doesn't mean the work isn't impressive. Giselbertus was a real master of body language as an expression of emotional feeling, and a lot of his work, as we'll see, has a kind of charm that makes it truly memorable. This figure of Eve, also attributed to Giselbertus, once decorated the north porch of the church, but was taken down at some point, cut in half, and used as part of the stairway to the bishop's residence. It's now in the Roland Museum, which, as I said, is right across the street from the church now. In his book Civilization, Kenneth Clark says that this is the first female figure since the fall of Rome to give an idea of the pleasures of the body. But in his book on the history of the nude in art, he says she looks like a tree trunk. He also calls this an unrivaled example of absent-minded detachment. She seems to have no clue about the seriousness of her act. She's just like, oh, I guess I'll just have an apple now. André Malraux referred to Giselbertus as the Cézanne de Moyen Âge, the Cézanne of the Middle Ages, which he certainly meant as a compliment, although I'm not sure why Cézanne came to his mind. Malraux also, and he's not alone in this, thinks that Giselbertus did essentially all the sculpture at Autun, and not only that, but also a lot of the work at other places like Vézelay and Cluny. I don't see how that could be possible. There are something like 400 figures at Autun alone. This is a capital from one of the nave columns now, and it's one of the most memorable of the things attributed to Giselbertus. We see the three magi here on their way to Bethlehem and sleeping as the angel points to the star that guides them and touchingly touches the hand of one of them as though in a vision. And it looks like Mary and Joseph weren't the only ones who had trouble finding rooms in an inn. The Magi have had to triple up here in a big pile in their room. Here's the one which depicts Noah's Ark, balanced very precariously on top of Mount Ararat. It's hard not to think that Giselbertus would have been a great illustrator of children's books in our own day. And don't take that as condescension. Some of the finest artwork to be found today is on the pages of children's books. There in the distance now you can see the famous former Cluniac Abbey Church of Mary Magdalene at Vézelay, and this is where, again, according to the Provençal legend, her bones are supposed to be buried, and because of that, the place was another major goal of pilgrims. The church was begun in 1096, but the people of the town revolted against the abbot's tax schemes to finance it and killed him. That's the way recall worked in the Middle Ages, I guess. The church was essentially finished during the tenure of the abbot Pons de Montboissier, brother of the famous Peter the Venerable, the abbot of Cluny, about whom we've heard. This is the facade of the church now. In the 13th century, the Gothic fronton, as it's called, was added above the entrance, and it survives pretty much intact. But between the 16th century wars of religion and the Revolution, all the rest of the sculpture was destroyed. It was replaced in the 19th century by work from the shop of the most famous of French restorers, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who certainly has his critics, but who is generally considered to have had better taste than many restorers of his era. Luckily, however, Vézelay has a big narthex or enclosed porch between the facade and the nave itself. So, while all the work on the facade was wrecked, the work inside here was preserved, and it is also attributed by most to Giselbertus. The central tympanum depicts Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles on the seventh Sunday following Easter. Here now is the nave of the church, and it has the heavy round arches of the 12th century Romanesque, but the choir is in the Gothic style of a century later, with pointed arches, bigger windows admitting more light, and a ribbed vault. And a lot of art historians say that the sine qua non of the Gothic style is the ribbed groin vault, not the pointed arch or anything else. And in light of that, you should notice that although Vézelay was a pilgrimage church, in the sense that it was a major goal of pilgrims, it does not have one of the main features of the pilgrimage Romanesque style of architecture, the barrel vault. At first glance that may look like a barrel vault, but it isn't. It's actually a groin vault, a sort of transitional step toward the ribbed groin vault of the Gothic style. It's a little hard to see what's going on there, But between each transverse striped arch, we have what in effect is a vault formed by the intersection of one barrel going north and south and another going east and west. The result looks something like a tent roof. This is not the earliest use of this kind of vault, but this was the largest space yet to be covered by one. You can see the capitals decorated with sculpture, again attributed by many to Giselbertus there too. This is the early 12th century church now of Notre-Dame-la-Grande in Poitiers, which has the most sculpturesque and sculpture-covered facade we've seen yet. It's sculpturesque in that it's covered with niches and columns, and these niches and most of the rest of the facade are filled with statues and decorations. Despite the heavy proportions and the lack of height, all this carved masonry does suggest the kind of look associated with Gothic facades, as does the large glass window. However, the original stained glass which was here, as in the case of virtually all such decoration in Romanesque churches, is long gone. This is the nave now. Although this was not an important pilgrimage church especially, it does have the barrel vault associated with the pilgrimage style. In the last century, the columns were painted in what is imagined to have been something like the garish look of the original Romanesque work. But this has proven controversial both in the community of art historians as well as in the local community of churchgoers. Art historians do generally think that something like this sort of decoration was once common, however. Before we leave the French Romanesque, there is one especially interesting example of it to see: the early 11th century tower of Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris. It's hard to believe, but a mere millennium ago, the area around this church was farmland owned by the abbey, and where such notable establishments as the Café du Magot and La Flore and Brasserie Lip are now, there were then stables and chicken coops. Few things in Paris have seen as much of the city's history as this. France has more than its share of important Romanesque churches, but there are many to be seen in other countries as well. Next we'll see some of the examples from across the border in Germany, and then from across the Channel in England. Next quarter we'll hear about the Romanesque in Italy as we lead up to the Renaissance there. This is the Abbey of Maria Laach west of Koblenz. It was built mostly in the 12th century, but the portico in front was added in the early 13th, although it's consistent in style with the older parts of the church. Several weeks ago, when I first talked about the Romanesque at Tournus, I mentioned that it is hard to really say what all Romanesque churches have in common. And even thinking back over just the French ones we've seen, I think you'd have to agree that one of the characteristics of the style is just variety. Pointed arches or round arches, groin vault or barrel vault, lots of sculpture or no sculpture, and so on. And there's even more variety if you start crossing national boundaries. One thing that distinguishes German churches along the Rhine anyway is color. Rhineland limestone can vary in color from light gray through brown, yellow, red, whereas in France it's almost entirely a sort of uniform cement color. In this picture, the church looks like it more often does in the bright sunlight, I guess, more of a brownish gray. In terms of architectural vocabulary, German churches are often distinguished by what are called bishop's mitre roofs, like the one on the central tower here, as well as blind and or columnless arcades, and what are called dwarf galleries, both of which you see here as well. This abbey also has a transept at the west end as well as at the east, which is something that goes back in the history of German architecture at least to St. Michael's at Hildesheim, which we saw earlier this quarter. The bottom line with the Romanesque is that pretty much any church built anywhere between 1000 and around 1150 can be called Romanesque, no matter what it looks like. This is the east end of the Church of the Holy Apostles in Cologne, which was begun in the 11th century but not finished until the 13th. It has the dwarf galleries, which incidentally are not galleries for dwarves. They're rather small galleries and are usually just inaccessible decoration. You can also see the bishop's mitre roof on the facade tower. This now is the primarily 12th century Cathedral of Worms in the Rhineland. The towers, which are especially prominent here, but which were also part of the Church of the Holy Apostles and the Church of Maria Laach, are also common features of the German or Rhineland Romanesque, as are the blind arcades here at the ground level and the columnless arcades, the scalloped bands on the towers, and the dwarf galleries again. We'll be back here in a few months to hear about the most famous event in the history of Worms, Luther's meeting with the Emperor Charles V in 1521. But if you've been in these lectures for a while, you know that the history of the relationship between the Church and Germany is full of rancorous disagreement. We heard earlier about the investiture controversy that involved the German Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII in a battle over who had the right to appoint bishops in Germany, and it was here at Worms that Henry proclaimed the deposition of Gregory, which was followed by Gregory's excommunication of Henry, leading to the latter's abject but transient surrender at Canossa in 1077. You may remember he was also excommunicate at the time of the First Crusade. In 1122, representatives of Pope Calixtus and Henry's son Henry V signed the Concordat of Worms here, by which the emperor essentially gave up the right to appoint or invest bishops. To many, the most impressive Romanesque church in Germany is the Cathedral of Speyer, which was built between about 1082 and 1125, although Conrad of Franconia, the elected successor to Henry II, about whom we heard a few weeks ago, is said to have founded the church somewhat earlier in the 11th century, and he was also the founder of the Salic or Franconian line of German emperors, which included Henry III, Henry IV, and Henry V, and he made the city Speyer near Worms along the Rhine his de facto capital. You should recognize by now the main features of this style we've been talking about, so I won't go over them all again. The facade here has been extensively restored, but most of the rest of the important parts of the church are original. This is the east end of the Cathedral of Speyer now. There's some irony in the fact that these churches, which are among the greatest in Germany in any style, were built during the reigns of these Salic emperors who spent so much of their lives excommunicate and forbidden by the Pope to even enter them. Conrad, the founder of the dynasty, is buried here, as are several of his successors, including Rudolf of Habsburg, the founder of the greatest dynasty in the history of Germany, about which we'll hear much more in the future. This is the nave of Speyer now, at 45 feet wide and 107 feet high. It is the widest and highest of all Romanesque naves. In fact, only a few Gothic churches have greater dimensions than this. It also is covered by the most impressive of all ribless groin vaults, Just as Speyer is pretty much unanimously considered the most impressive German Romanesque church, the Cathedral of Durham in northern England is likewise generally considered the most impressive English example of the Romanesque, which, remember, is called the Norman style in the British Isles, and it has the advantage of a very dramatic setting above the River Wear. Durand, in fact, calls this the most impressive Romanesque church in the whole of Europe. Actually, however, a good deal of what you see in this view is later Gothic work. The facade towers were built around 1200 and the crossing tower was erected in the 15th century. You may remember that after Lindisfarne was sacked by the Vikings, the monks fled with the body of St. Cuthbert in their famous gospel book, which we saw earlier, and Eventually, Cuthbert and the book wound up here, although no trace of any church earlier than the 11th century is now above ground. As we see it now, the cathedral was begun in 1093. Now you're looking up at the church from below, and you can see that the window was also redone in the Gothic style, but the glass in it is now 19th century. In the 12th century, the bishops of Durham were among the most powerful men in the whole country. The most famous, Hugh Puiset, was the great-grandson of William the Conqueror, a sometime friend of his cousin Richard the Lionhearted, and longtime rival of another powerful bishop, William Longchamp of Ely. Longchamp was named chancellor, but when Richard went off on his crusade, he and Hugh Puiset of Durham were made joint justiciars or regents. Longchamp, however, was not good at sharing anything, and he was able to take over the regency by himself. Thomas B. Costain calls him a skillful ferret. Just above the trees, you can see the top of the large porch, which in England is called a Galilee. It's what's called a narthex on the continent, and this Galilee is the main contribution Hugh Puiset made to the building of the church. In 1228, Richard de la Poer, who was, as Bishop of Salisbury, already responsible for one of the most impressive Gothic churches in England, became Bishop of Durham and designed the east end of the cathedral here in the typical flat East End style, which became popular in England. Behind this work inside is what's called the Chapel of the Nine Altars. This is a partial view of the chapel from inside now. And now you're looking down the whole nave toward that east end. By Hugh's day, most of what you see in this picture would have been finished, and the most remarkable part of it all is the ribbed groin vault, which is probably the earliest in England and possibly the earliest anywhere. The ribbed vault is a key feature of the Gothic style, but it is not enough by itself to make a church Gothic. The ribs here are very heavy compared to the more elegant examples of the 13th century to come, and the whole nave below the vault is thoroughly Norman in character, certainly with its massive piers and round arches. You should notice the carved decoration on the single columns. This is the kind of thing sometimes used to support the repainting of churches like Notre Dame la Grande in garish geometrical patterns. It's likely that these columns at Durham were once painted in a similar way. The rib should be regarded as essentially a decorative rather than a structural feature. The idea was apparently to accentuate the tent-like effect of the plain groin vault and actually make it look lighter by putting more masonry up there. That's not altogether successful here, but by the 13th century, ribbed groin vaults will come to look so light and delicate that air alone could almost, it would seem, hold them up. Before we leave Durham, I just want to show you this picture taken in the old scriptorium where monks used to spend their days working their fingers to the bone, copying manuscripts. Now that's all just left up to Brother Xerox here. This now is the Cathedral of Ely, north of Cambridge from the air, and as important as Durham is, there are not many English churches more impressive than this. A quick glance at this view will tell you that the building history of this church, like that of Durham and many others, includes both Norman and the Gothic. To the west of the crossing, the church is Norman and was finished during William Longchamp's tenure as bishop. The original lantern or tower over the crossing collapsed, however, in 1322, necessitating a reconstruction of both the lantern itself and the choir, which are now consequently in the Gothic style of the 14th century, and the Lady Chapel to the north of the choir was also added at this time. This is the facade now at ground level. The north side to the left collapsed in a storm in 1701. The frequent use in England of a single dominant tower rather than the two towers flanking the facade, which is more common in France, for example, is seen here, and may be owed to the look of Anglo-Saxon churches like Earl's Barton we saw. In the 14th century, the height of the tower was increased by the addition of another story in the Gothic style, as you can see, but the rest of the surviving facade is as it was in the days of Longchamp. Longchamp was not that popular in England, a fact which helped John in his efforts to usurp the throne from Richard, to whom Longchamp, despite his faults, was completely loyal. John was eventually able to force him to leave the country, but after Richard was ransomed, and it was Longchamp who arranged the details of that business, he restored Longchamp to his offices, and John could only sulk. It was probably lucky for Longchamp, though, that he died before John succeeded Richard. He died in France, but his heart was returned to England, and it's buried in his church. We'll hear a lot more about Richard and John later. This is the nave of Ely now. Its original wooden roof, not uncommon in Romanesque churches, was replaced in the 19th century, but the rest of the nave in this view is as it was when Longchamp last saw it. As I mentioned a moment ago, however, the original lantern collapsed on the choir in the 14th century, and you can see the pointed arches that mark the start of the Gothic section of the church there under the new lantern called the octagon, built by architects named Alan de Walsingham and William Hurley, and it is one of the real masterpieces of medieval building. In this picture you're looking up at it now, Hurley is described simply as a carpenter, which is a bit like describing Bach as an organist, I think. Hurley was much more than what we think of as a carpenter if he was responsible for this. This view from more or less the same spot shows you at a glance the difference between the style of the Norman nave to the left and the Gothic crossing and choir to the right. The Gothic style in England is itself often subdivided into Early English, which is more or less the 13th century style, Decorated, which is more or less the 14th century style, and Perpendicular, which covers more or less the 15th century. According to that way of seeing things, this is Decorated, but you don't want to take terms like decorated and perpendicular too literally. This is the east end of the Cathedral of Norwich, or Norwich. Norwich is what the English call it. And here again you can pretty much see the history of English medieval building style at a glance. At the bottom is the 12th century Norman work. Above that is the 14th century section, so it's called Decorated, and the vaulting is 15th century, so it's called Perpendicular. I doubt, though, that the decorated section really looks any more decorated than it does perpendicular to you, however, if you're thinking in terms of the usual meanings of these words. And what's perpendicular about that vault? Next week we'll see some more examples of the English Gothic representing the early English period, but we won't hear much more about the decorated and perpendicular really till next fall when we get more into the 14th and 15th centuries. Many of the most important English Gothic churches are essentially in those styles, some not finished until into the 16th century, into Henry VIII's day. This now is the reclining tomb effigy, the Gisant, of King Louis VI of France. It's in Saint-Denis, the famous abbey, which was to be the pantheon of French royalty from Merovingian times until the Revolution. You may remember that in 987, Hugh Capet founded the Capetian line of French kings, but Louis here, who was his great-great-grandson and the son of that Philip I who didn't go on the First Crusade, was really the first one of importance.
In this picture, his tomb is behind that of his grandfather, Henry I.
He was known as Louis le Gros, which is usually translated Louis the Fat, but that gives you the wrong impression. I don't know how overweight he was, but in any case, he was Big Louis in the sense that Al Capone was Big Al.
Here he is up closer. Like a lot of the Gisons at Saint Denis, this is not a real portrait. In the 13th century, St. Louis IX, commissioned many of them to honor his predecessors rather than to show us what they looked like.
We know a lot about him because one of the most remarkable men of the 12th century, Abbot Suger de Saint Denis, was a good friend of his and wrote a biography of him in which he is represented as a virtual tornado of energy, punishing the wicked and making firm his rightful authority. This is one of the surviving items which were once part of Suger's treasure of objets d'art, and he does seem to have been one of the few people of the age whom we might really regard as a patron of the arts and collector in something like the modern sense, even if you think he might have sometimes have shown better taste in his choices. Alan Temko wrote that people in the Middle Ages rarely showed bad taste, but I think he probably hadn't seen this. It's an antique Roman vase made into a bird. It looks like something Napoleon might have put on his dinner table. This is a sardonyx and gold chalice now in the Washington National Gallery, which Suger also had made. Saint Denis was not a Cluniac abbey, but no abbot of Cluny was ever more devoted to the idea that the church should be a splendid place with splendid stuff in it than Suger de Saint Denis. This was not a wine glass for dinner parties, but a chalice for use in the Mass. He writes, "To me, I confess, one thing has always seemed preeminently fitting, that every costliest thing should serve first and foremost for the administration of the Holy Eucharist." And then he goes on, "Detractors object that a saintly mind, a pure heart, a faithful intention ought to suffice for this sacred function, and we too explicitly affirm that it is these that principally matter. But we profess that we must do homage also through the outward ornaments of sacred vessels, and to nothing in the world in an equal degree as to the service of the holy sacrifice, with all inward purity and with all outward splendor." This rock crystal ewer also once belonged to him. For this kind of thing, Suger was often the focus of criticism from people like Saint Bernard the Cistercian, who complained that this would only bring the admiration of fools and the prayers of the simple. "The church," wrote Bernard, "is resplendent in her walls, beggarly in her poor. She clothes her stones in gold and leaves her sons naked. The rich man's eye is fed at the expense of the indigent. The curious find delight, but the needy find no relief." Suger's favorite thing in the church was the altarpiece, which was melted in the Revolution, but which we can see as it looked to Suger in this detail from a painting of about 1500, attributed to the anonymous Master of St. Giles. Leaving aside the subject of the painting, the altarpiece depicted was donated to the abbey in the 9th century by Charles the Bald, and the cross on top is said to have been made by Saint Eloi, the 7th century patron saint of goldsmiths. Suger, in fact, thought that the contemplation of such worldly beauty and perfection would serve to lead the soul to aspire to the absolute perfection of heaven. Lead the soul from what was transient to what was eternal, from the material to the spiritual, de materialibus ad immaterialia, as he puts it. Despite his importance as a writer and connoisseur, he is now primarily remembered as the man who was essentially the architect of the new abbey church at Saint Denis, begun about 1137, and in which it is usually said all the elements of the Gothic style first came together. And you see it here now, It's on the right with the 18th century addition to the complex to its left, to the left as you look at this picture. According to tradition, after Saint Denis, the first bishop of Paris, was beheaded on the hill named Montmartre after him, he picked up his head and carried it 10 miles to this spot, which was then about 10 miles outside the city, which has grown so as to completely surround it. An abbey in his honor was founded here, and it became, as I've said, the favorite burial place of French royalty. It used to be a difficult place to see, but now there's a metro stop right in front of it. And here you see the facade now. Most churches are built beginning at the east so that the altar area will be finished first, but Suger began his work at the west, at the front here, then built the choir. Then the nave, along with the upper part of the choir, were finished after his death. The facade originally had 2 towers in the style of French Norman churches we've seen, but architects trying to repair the north one in the 19th century accidentally knocked it down altogether, and a project is currently underway to finance its rebuilding. The facade is sculpturesque itself, and both it and the door jambs and timpani were filled with sculpture, although most of this has been lost to vandalism. The rose window, which will become one of the commonest decorations of Gothic churches, is probably the earliest one in France, though none of the glass is original. A few fragments of the statuary that was once here are now on display in the Cluny Museum. This fellow is called a king, but whether he was or not, he was beheaded in the Revolution just to make sure no kings kept their heads. And this is a similar head of a queen or queen-like person, and she once stood beside the central portal. And here's the choir now, with pointed arches, ribbed groin vaults, and stained glass windows. We've seen pointed arches in Cistercian abbeys, a ribbed groin vault at Durham, and although it's all gone, there was stained glass in many Romanesque churches. But this is where they were likely all put together for the first time. There are also flying buttresses outside the upper choir, and flying buttresses are also usually considered integral to the Gothic style, although some important Gothic churches make little or no use of them. Here's a piece of the original glass which actually has Suger in it. And Suger himself says that the most important thing here is in fact the quality of the light in the church, the quality made possible by the great increase in the size and number of stained glass windows. He was likely influenced to think this way by the writings of the fellow now known as Dionysius the Pseudo-Areopagite, a 5th century, probably Syrian mystical theologian who claimed to have been the companion of Paul, known as Dionysius the Areopagite. In France, to make things even more confusing, he was also popularly identified with the Saint Dionysius, that is, Saint Denis, who had brought Christianity to Paris, and to whom, of course, this abbey was dedicated. In any case, in the writings attributed to him, light is regarded as the most spiritual of earthly things, the most immaterial of the material. It makes creation and growth and knowledge possible. It is viewed as a kind of mystical analog to the Holy Spirit. Here now is the upper choir, which was completed by Pierre de Montreuil in the 13th century in the full flower of the Gothic style. It's no coincidence that in the 13th century it became the custom to read the Pieta de Lux Mundi, the light of the world, in the opening passage of the Gospel of John at the close of Mass. And this is another view of the upper choir here. This now is the Cathedral of Sens, often called the earliest Gothic cathedral in France. Remember, Saint-Denis is an abbey. It's possible that this was actually begun before Suger's work at Saint-Denis, in fact. They were being built in any case at about the same time. It's worth pointing out in looking at this church, which was never finished, that in fact very few, one could even justify saying none, of the great French Gothic churches look today exactly like the original architects intended them to. Mostly this is simply because they just took so long to build.
This is the interior now.
Sens, about 50 miles southeast of Paris, was actually the seat of the archdiocese that included Paris until the 17th century. And when the archbishop himself here, whose name was Henry the Boar, went for the new Gothic style, it immediately advanced its popularity in the whole Ile-de-France. The bishops of Chartres and Paris were under his ecclesiastical jurisdiction. This is another early French Gothic church, the Cathedral of Léon, about 50 miles northeast of Paris. It was begun about 1160, and it looks finished in this view, but its towers were supposed to have spires, and there were originally to be 7 of them. What everyone remembers first about Léon, though, is the cows in the belfries. What are they doing there? The usual explanation is that the statues were placed there to honor the beast labor which helped build the church. Maybe. I don't have anything better to suggest. Here's the interior of this church now. The interior of Sens has a 3-story nave, but many begun in the 12th century, the classic period it's sometimes called, have 4 stories like this one, with an arcade, a gallery, triforium, and clerestory. They also have sexpartite vaults, that is, the bays, as they are called, between the pointed transverse arches crossing the nave, have 6 sections, and there are heavy single piers holding up the arcades. The Cathedral of Léon is in fact very similar to Notre Dame in Paris, and we'll be back to see it next week. But now that we've gotten a start on the Gothic style, we'll hear a bit about some of the personalities of this era, beginning with Louis VI's son, Louis VII, and his famous wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and we'll do that right after the break.